Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. Today's topic is something I've wanted to talk about for a long time, and after I introduce our guest and we get going, I will share one of my grief confessions with you. With us today is David Perotto of Bartolomeo and Perotto Funeral Homes right here in Rochester, New York. This is an organization that I have, I've attended some workshops they have. They have some wonderful workshops, and they are just all around great people. As well, one of their staff members was on a podcast, about 3 years ago, I think. And that's Rocky, the therapy dog, who I finally had a chance to meet. Rocky's wonderful. Hi, David. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to sit with us today.
Yeah, very happy to be with you.
Super. Thank you very much. Before I get started with my questions, of which I have many, would you just share with our listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so our funeral home has been here in the community for about 102 years now. I've been as a funeral director here for over 30. So I grew up in Rochester, spent my whole life here, love the community here in Greece. I've been living in a home now since 1993. My roots are here and really enjoy being here and a part of the community.
Well, that's super. They are very warm and welcoming staff at the funeral home. And if you're looking for that service, I strongly encourage you to check them out. Okay, time for true confessions. Everybody knows from listening to my podcast that my husband, Tom, died in 2018. Now, everyone who goes through a loss, who was in the position of primary caregiver or closest to that person or most responsible, has to go through that period where you have to figure out what to do after that death, what type of service to have, what to do with the body. If you're fortunate enough, that person has conveyed their wishes. Tom was never one to talk about that, so all decisions rested with me. And even though he had been ill for 8 months, and it might seem that I had plenty of time to think about what was I going to do, how was I going to handle it, I still found myself with that grief brain that everyone talks about. I did manage to get through a funeral service, calling hours, and I remember leaving the funeral home. Sadly, it was not Bartolomeo Perotto, or this may have had a different outcome. But I left the funeral home that day carrying a box of my late husband's ashes in the crook of my arm. And I remember standing beside my car that afternoon with my younger daughter, Kelly, who occasionally co-hosts. And I looked at Kelly and I said, "What am I going to do with these ashes?" And she looked at me kind of funny and said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I can't put them in the trunk. It just didn't feel right." And we both kind of laughed at that. So I set him gently in the back seat and went home, where I placed the box of ashes on a shelf in my office, where I could see it every time I sat at my desk. Truth is, folks, I never could decide what to do with Tom's ashes. 4 years later, his ashes were still sitting in that box. So I really need this conversation today, David. What could I have done with Tom's ashes?
Yeah, this is certainly a topic that comes up. Traditionally, people have customs where they go to a cemetery, and that's certainly an appropriate way of placing ashes somewhere permanently. It doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
My family, we all are in the same cemetery. I all have the same entire family. Both sides of my mom, my dad's family are all in the same cemetery. So for us, that makes a whole lot of sense. For some people, they're more transient these days, so that those roots in a community don't always happen because they're spread out throughout the entire United States or internationally. So it's not as natural to find a permanent resting place in those situations.
Right.
And the one thing we always caution people with, when you don't think you're going to be going into a cemetery, try to think about it for a bit, because once you make a decision such as scattering, you can't undo it.
Right.
But there are many ways of having ashes placed places. And I'll share a story right off the bat. I'm a scuba diver, and we talked about this, Kathy. I was scuba diving about 2 years ago, and I've been aware of a way of scattering ashes in the ocean. It's a paper mache covering. The ashes are glued inside that. You have a ceremony on a boat, and you pray, and the ashes go out, and as it gets waterlogged, it sinks. Well, lo and behold, I'm scuba diving, and I get to the end of my dive, and this is a time for safety stop. So you got 3 minutes at 15 feet. And as we're approaching the safety stop, my dive master looks at me, and I can see one of these coming to the ocean floor, and I'm like, well, I got to go see this. Oh. So I abandoned the safety stop, which wasn't too wise, I guess.
Wasn't very safe.
No, maybe not. I had to go look, and I did. And I went over, and this thing floated at the bottom of the ocean floor. And you can see that it was starting to disintegrate, and the ashes were just going to kind of settle on the ocean floor on a reef, which I was so happy to see, honestly. So I got back to my safety stop, and I had explained myself later. But I've always seen these things, marketed, and to see that from the bottom up was really neat.
Wow. That's an incredible story. And in fact, someone in my family, a niece and her husband, they're starting to make their plans for their final wishes and everything, although they're only in their 50s, but I applaud them for doing it, especially after going through it with Tom with no planning. And they are in Florida. And there's a place in Florida that has an entire area mapped out. I almost want to say it's called Neptune's something. It has a website where you can actually have the ashes buried underneath, and there's a controlled area where they're doing it, where you have a specific location and everything.
Yeah, there's Neptune and Eternal Reefs. Eternal Reefs is a little more pricey, but their model is a little different. They have these forms. They're like a cube that are concrete, and they mix ashes into the concrete. So these cubes are placed in the ocean and become part of the reef. In the future.
Yeah.
I checked their website this morning. They have 20 more planned events this year to have these done throughout Texas, Florida, I think it was Carolina, even New Jersey.
Wow. Yeah, to a lot of people that love cruising, having a final resting place that's in wonderful blue ocean and everything is very tempting. What if someone's not really ocean minded or anything? What options are there for us on land?
So you can't just scatter just anywhere, because that's not, you can't get permission for that. Some cemeteries do have scatter gardens. Right here in Rochester, Whitehaven has both a scatter garden and also to the back of the cemetery, it's like a nature walk, which is pretty neat. Yeah, they have this kind of like pathway through the woods, and there's cremains locations throughout, which is a really nice area. So that can be a nice alternative to traditional, burial. Mm-hmm. People will sometimes have ashes kind of divided. So you can have jewelry, you can have little miniature urns. And then jewelry options there's so many things you can do. There are companies that'll take ash and create blown glass and put the ash in the blown glass. There are little vessels that would hold a small amount of cremains, like a cross or a charm. Mm-hmm. So those are all very, very common, of course. But then that's not going to use up all the ash. The 200 cubes is, it's a fair amount of ashes. But that's a partial way of doing things. People will place them without permission in public places. Don't ask, don't tell.
Right. But it's not legal, is it? Can we just clarify that you can't just arbitrarily decide to go to a golf course, for example, and scatter ashes?
Yeah. I mean, it's done a lot. I mean, people tell me all the time how they will do those things. Joe Altabelli, who we all know in Rochester, they had placed his ashes at the ballpark. Yeah. But that was officially okay.
Right.
It was very appropriate. And he told us that before he passed, that that's what he wanted.
Right.
It makes perfect sense. So that's where he is. The reefs are a great idea, but there's also some people there's a company out there that will scatter them via a plane. So as it's flying through the air, it'll scatter ashes out the window.
Oh.
So that's a company, they get permission somehow. I'm not sure, but they do that. Mm-hmm. Some people have diamonds made.
Diamonds?
Yeah, you can take a small amount of ash, and this company it's a carbonization process, and they'll make a special diamond just for you. It's certainly not inexpensive, but it's a really neat idea.
Wow. All kinds of ideas. And what about in forests and everything? I think I've read somewhere about turning, not necessarily cremains, but the body, maybe it is cremains, I don't know, but being planted like as a tree or something?
Yeah, that's a somewhat newer idea. It can be a tree, yeah. They have the ashes in a tube, and there's a seed in there. So you plant that in the ground, and as a tree grows, your ashes will be kind of dispersed in that area there. I would imagine maybe some of that makes its way into its actual tree, but it's mostly probably in the ground around the tree.
Okay. All right. And are there restrictions as to where you can plant those? Could you, say, plant one in your backyard, for example?
You can. The one drawback to that is, what if you sell the property someday?
Well, yeah.
So that's the thing to think about. Does that bother you?
Right.
It may not, but it's something to consider. Yeah.
Right. And of course, people can opt to just place the ashes in an urn or some other type of vessel and keep it. I know some people find comfort in having that near them, where they see it, where they can either pray to it, talk to it, whatever. It's everyone's level of comfort. So if someone is faced with this decision, what are your suggestions as far as how do they make their decision?
Yeah, in fact, this weekend I was emailing with a lady. Her husband died almost a year ago now, and they'd have a spot in the cemetery, but she's down in Florida. She has his ashes in Florida, and for the last year, she created a shrine where she has an area where she has his picture in the ashes, and she goes there on occasion when she's missing him and maybe talks to him. I'm not sure, but reflects on him and his life. And she said to me via email over the weekend that gives her comfort. So, and I told her, we'll keep doing it. Keep doing that. If that's making you feel good, then, that's okay.
Absolutely.
And I said to her, and she asked me about the ashes, and she said, well, should I consider not putting them in the niche? And I suggested to her that maybe she should, but maybe not now. You have the spot, you thought about it, the both of you someday will be there together long term. So hold on to it. In the meantime, keep them, and then someday we can put you both together in the spot that they have chosen ahead of time.
Okay. And as far as putting together, does it ever occur where, say, the spouse's ashes are mixed together into the same vessel?
Yes, we have done that. There's also some urns there's one in particular that's shaped in the form of a heart, and there's two halves. So each one is a vessel, and when you put them together, it forms a heart. So they're not mixed, but they're together.
Okay.
There are companion urns, as they call them, that are double the size. And then generally we would mix the ashes together, and both husband and wife are in that same companion urn. So that's pretty common, actually.
Okay, so you can mix the ashes together.
Right.
So in that case, then it would make perfect sense for one spouse to hold their late spouse's ashes in the urn until they themselves could join them.
Correct. And many people too, your husband and wives don't always agree upon disposition. Some want cremation, some want burial. If the first person dies wants cremation, keep the ashes at home, and you can place that urn inside the casket later. That happens a lot as well.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting thought as well. And in the area of disagreement, do you have any thoughts or suggestions? You probably have stories about, say, mother and father who died, their ashes are placed in a common urn or a companion urn and left to the children who really don't want the ashes.
Yeah, that's the conversation that sometimes people forget to think about. And like that story with this lady over the weekend, I cautioned her. I said, well, what will happen to your ashes long term if you don't do this? Because they don't think about 20 years from now.
Yeah.
If you leave them with somebody and like you're saying, that it's not as meaningful 2 generations down the line, what do I do with these things?
Right. Some people are just plain uncomfortable having cremains around.
Right, exactly. So they go into a closet, or and if that person dies and someone's going to a closet and finds these things, what do I do?
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine that. I do know a family that happened to, and the ashes were in, it wasn't a decorative urn. It was more, I guess it was a metal or something like that. It wasn't quite as obvious what it was. And somebody bought one of those, you know how sometimes storage sheds go on auction and everything because they're unclaimed. And somebody got this metallic container and they opened it only to have ashes everywhere. So I know that does happen. So it does bring up the topic then of talking ahead of time. And I have already, because of what I went through with Tom, I have already started talking with my children about what's going to happen to me. I have decided I prefer to be cremated because both of my parents are buried at the cemetery. I never visit the cemetery. I am just not that person that will go graveside and visit. I will talk to my parents, both of them, sitting in a rocking chair in my room. I'll have a conversation, but I'm not comfortable going graveside. So for me personally, I'm trying to find an option that I can express to my children, this is what I want done with my remains. I don't want either of them to have to keep my ashes. So I'm trying to find out from them, and these are not easy conversations, what they would like. And I know my older daughter, Stephanie, has already expressed that she would like some type of jewelry to have part of my remains in, whether it's filled into a little charm, as you said, or whether it's blown glass or something. Now, if she hears the diamond thing, that might appeal to her as well. So these conversations are important. But can we segue a minute to funerals in general? It seems to me that there's some new trends in the areas of funerals. I don't see the same things I saw when I was a young adult. I'm seeing more celebration of life services and not traditional funerals. Can you shed any insight on that topic for us?
This is my perspective as I sit back, and I grew up as a Catholic, and I'm still Catholic. I'm going to pick on that a little bit since it's myself. So let's say I die, and there's a funeral mass for me, and let's call it 100 people attend. But not all 100 people would be Catholic.
Right.
So as they come to experience the loss, because it's a friend or a family member, and you're in a church that's not familiar with your religion, and if it only speaks to the religious side of things, it seems almost like a meaningless experience for somebody. So if we do not focus on why we're here, which is somebody died and they meant something to me, the funeral would have no meaning. And we've always had religion drive what a funeral experience would be.
Right.
It really should have been, no, why are we here? This person meant this to me, and let's talk about it. Person was special because this is what they did in life. This is why they were meaningful to the family and friends and community at large. And as I sit back, we do a lot of these kind of funeral ceremonies in the funeral home now because a lot of people don't have connection to faith. Maybe a third of the people today have no regular attendance in the church anywhere. So when in those situations, we step in and say, well, let's have a service that talks about that person's life.
Right.
And have people share that story. It's even meaningful for me, and I'm a complete stranger, to sit through a ceremony when I learn about this person and what they meant. For example, just the other day, we had that service, and this gentleman worked for Kodak, and his job at Kodak took him to like 31 countries throughout the world.
Wow.
I got to hear that story about him, and I thought it was the neatest thing,
Yeah.
So if it was meaningful for me, imagine how meaningful it was for the people who knew him better than I did.
Exactly.
So these experiences can be really a tribute and a healing process. And by doing this, by sharing these life stories and talking, it can be a healing process.
Right. And what about people that don't really want a service in a church or a funeral home? Is it possible to have a service outside?
Yeah, I had one this summer where we had at the Webster Park. They have a pavilion. It's a really nice place down there. And she unfortunately died while she was in Europe, and they decided to have it. That was one of her favorite places was Webster Park. So we did this ceremony there, and we had a large attendance. We probably had 140 people there, and it was a really neat ceremony.
Yeah.
And it was and most people told me as they were leaving that they thought it was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is possible to be a little creative then with a service or celebration. And for that, though, you really need the guidance of a funeral director because they know the laws. They know what you can and can't do.
So in that situation, let's use that as an example. I thought we were important because, things I think about. When we started planning that, I knew she was somewhat younger, and I started panicking about the size of the venue. Mm-hmm. And so I started telling the family, no, we need to think about chairs. We need to think about, if we're going to have an hour-long ceremony, people can't stand for an hour. What happens if we have too many people for the space? And in that situation, we were really close. It worked, but I was getting a little nervous. But throughout the process, I had to make sure we had enough chairs, set it up properly so we could maximize the space to have people seated so we didn't exceed the space. So if you space the chairs too far out, instead of packing in 140 people, you only pack in 100. What do you do with those other 40 people?
Right.
Simple things like that I'm experienced at that could make a world of a difference. The whole thing could have been ruined if we didn't, maximize that space.
Right.
And then you got hearing issues. Well, how can everybody hear? So we brought a portable speaker with us.
Mm-hmm.
And just for all those little things that you may not think about, that things that we have experience with that are important to kind of draw on.
Right, right. And I suppose it's legal. If someone lost someone important to them and they had that person cremated and they had the ashes in the urn, I suppose they could have a picnic in a park or something and have their own informal ceremony. But like you say, there are risks. You have to think about the comfort of your guests. People are generally uncomfortable attending any type of a funeral service anyway, because they never quite know what to expect. I remember with Tom's service, he had been a staunch member of the Vietnam Veterans of America for his service in Vietnam. And as part of his service, again, my decision, I had requested that the chapter's honor guard come and they would stand sentry by the casket during calling hours and during the ceremony. And they have their own process and procedure. It was also their way of saying goodbye to their brother in arms. So I wanted to respect that because I knew that was very important to Tom. What I did not expect, so thankfully it was a funeral home. It was actually the funeral home in Hilton. And they actually wound up having to bring in the fire department's auxiliary crowd control because there were so many people attending his service that I hadn't anticipated. And had I decided to do something totally independent in a park, I don't know what I would have done with all that, because there were probably about 500 people in and out that morning for the calling hours portion of it before the service ever started. And they actually had to do traffic control on the town's streets. So you can't prepare, nor, must I add, in that foggy brain you have after you lose someone, you even stop and think of those things.
Yeah, and the one thing we'll also add to that is when we're there to take care of logistics, you're there to be there. You know, so you don't have to worry.
Exactly.
So you can be there to be with your friends and family, and that's support one another, and let those other things just kind of happen.
Yeah, it's tough enough to make it through that day. As I recall, the little bits I recall of it, oddly enough, I recall the parts that made me smile or the ones that really tugged at my heart. I remember the Tim Hortons coffee cup placed on the podium as a friend of Tom's stood up to talk about how Tom had impacted his life. And Tom was insistent on Tim Hortons coffee every day. So just seeing that coffee cup there brought a big smile to my face. Another friend of his stepped up to the podium with a bottle of hot sauce, also something near and dear to Tom from his service and everything. So it's those pieces, and you need to be able, as a grieving spouse, child, parent, whatever, you need to be free to experience those things and have those pieces as reminders and memories of that last tribute to your loved one. It is crucial. It really is.
Yeah, it truly is. And sometimes you need to dig a little deeper. So hopefully that a funeral director is guiding you and digging a little deeper so that those meaningful things do come forward, so they're not forgotten,
Yeah, I would agree. And most funeral homes, I know Bartolomeo and Perotto does, has something that they will continue after the service for the bereaved family. What does your funeral home offer?
Well, the first thing we offer, because immediately afterwards people start panicking about financial things. So when I'm meeting to plan the funeral, I let them know, put those things later. We're going to give you a guide, a handout to help you with those things for after the funeral. Don't concern yourself with those things today. Get through the funeral and then work on the financial and the checklist of all those things you got to do, which is a lot of work. Sometimes people are surprised at how many contacts and communications you need to make after someone passes. So we give them a guide to help remind them of who to contact and helpful contact numbers and things like that, which is a real big help. But then there's the grieving side, which is very important as well. So we try to have an annual holiday grief seminar. We try to have some follow-up emails, some things that can help people, with the day-to-day, when they're having a grief burst or you're not crazy, it's okay to feel this way kind of things. So messaging to help them throughout. We bring in Dr. Alan Wolfelt every so often, and he'll be here not until next year, 2026. We have him coming in. He's one of the foremost leaders in grief recovery, and he's just, his amount of knowledge on the topic is amazing. So we enjoy bringing him in. And also when people are struggling, refer them to extra, if you need some more one-on-one help, we try to connect people with counselors if they really, really are having a hard time to get through the difficult spots.
Yeah, I was not fortunate enough to have that experience. So I'm just going to say to listeners out there that if you think this type of service and connection would be valuable to you, then as you start to look for what funeral home might help you after a death, ask them about that. As well, you have a list of resources, of which I'm proud to say this podcast is on your resource list. Thank you very much for doing that. But that resource list can be so beneficial because, let's face it, there are so many phonies out there. There are so many people out there just trying to make the money. But the people that deal in bereavement, in grief support and everything, most of them are very, very genuine. But when you have the additional benefit of being handed a resource list from a funeral home, you know that these are services that have been vetted, that they are credible services, that they are genuine, and that they will provide you the support you need. So I encourage you to be cautious as you, I hate to say shop for, but that's really what you do. And all of that boils down to the topic that I'm just going to turn the microphone right over to David, because I want to talk a little bit about planning. You've heard me say that I'm working on that now. In fact, I'm going to meet with David a little later this month to talk about my own personal plan, because I've had the benefit, I guess, of having both experiences. My mother was the inveterate planner. She planned everything down to the final detail. She bought her casket ahead of time. She knew exactly what she wanted. She had her services planned out right down to the music she wanted played, so that after she died, I didn't have to make those decisions. I just went to the funeral home that she had directed me to go to, and they pulled out her file with all of her arrangements in it. I cannot tell you how special that gift was for me and my brother, because we didn't have to choose. We made one minor change, and that was just in the location of the service, just because of some things that had transpired in her last years. But that was a gift. And then, of course, with Tom, he wouldn't even talk about the fact that he had a brain cancer from which there was no recovery. He would not sit and talk with me at all about any of his wishes, any of the things he wanted done. I had to make all those decisions. That was excruciating. So I'm going to say, and I'm going to advocate for planning. With that in mind, David, I'm now going to turn the microphone and the floor over to you. So go get them.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what you just said. I mean, the best way I can relate this, when you plan ahead, the survivors, it is a gift. It truly is. And you can't understate that enough, because no one, and I mean nobody, has ever told me they regret pre-planning. Not a one. And what it does, at the very least, it creates an outline. I want burial. I want cremation. I want a service here or there. I want, certain things. Those big decisions puts at rest all those little ones. So little ones, you can tweak this, you can tweak that, and know that you're not violating someone's what they wanted for themselves. Mm-hmm. And that just gives people comfort. The worst situations I have is when someone sits in front of me and says, I have no idea what to do. And that leaves them a lot of doubts and question marks afterwards. Did we do the right thing? So take away those question marks by planning ahead. And not just that, it's also planning ahead financially. So, you can have the most elaborate funeral, but if you've only got X amount of assets left, you got to kind of balance that as well. So having a budget to those requests and having it all line up is really important. And if it doesn't line up, maybe you can get life insurance to help out or start planning for it so you can make the finances side work to what you want. And it's better to do that ahead of time than scramble last minute. It's also already a stressful enough event. You don't need to be putting all these other things and compounding that problem. So that I can just tell you is really just so critical. Maybe only, I would guess, 30 to 40% of the population pre-plans their funeral. It really should be 80 or 90%, and it would just make everybody's lives easier.
Yeah, I can't say that enough. And I have to keep reiterating what I said about my mother. It just, the burden was removed, and it was a blessing. It was a gift. And I know for me personally, I could focus on my memories of her and on the service and on the people that came with their wishes and their memories and everything. And that's why I call it a gift. I really, really do. I also, go ahead.
To add on to that too, it can also be an additive thing. And what I mean by this, I'll give you an example. Again, this last week I had a ceremony in the funeral home, and the person that died wrote some memoirs. So he had the grandchildren come forward and share the stories he wrote about himself to make sure everybody knew some of the stories that might have been a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Grandchildren probably never heard some of these things. So to sit down and think about your life and what the ceremony can be, that was a very meaningful experience for the family. Mm-hmm. And truly, you can make something special when you plan properly and kind of think about it a bit.
Yeah, and I'll kind of tag along on that because I actually know of a couple of books that have been written that actually are prompts, questions that you can answer, and you wind up with a book filled with your life. I remember one book, in fact, it's right on my shelf. There's a book written for things you want to tell your child, your daughter or your son. And it might be talk about the first rock concert you ever attended or things like that. What was a bad day in high school like for you? And you simply fill those things out in the book. Once you're gone, this book then becomes a legacy, and your children and grandchildren can read it later, and they get to know who you really were. These books are wonderful with the questions they ask. I'm actually helping a veteran right now complete his, and he's not able to write in the book. So what he does is I gave him a little recorder, and he's recording the answers to the questions in the book, and then I'm transcribing them for him and putting them in a document that we'll later have bound as a book for his grandkids. That was actually done. His grandkids gave him the book for Christmas.
Perfect. Yeah. And we have a planning form that we ask questions about people's lives, while they're alive. Their life story can be jotted down, right, and part of the funeral planning, so that some of those stories are kind of cataloged and used for the ceremony.
Exactly. Exactly.
Not just put on a shelf somewhere.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say just before I wrap up, because time as always is fleeting. It just flies by, especially when I have great conversations like this. But the other thing that planning ahead can do, your gift, is it can prevent conflict in your family. Often especially when there's a large family, if you haven't made plans and expressed your wishes for what you want done with your body, there may be someone of your children, for example, let's go with that scenario, a parent dies. One of your children may want you cremated because that's maybe what they want. Another child may not want that. They want that body to be placed in a casket and buried so that they can go visit graveside. And you wind up with all this conflict in the family. If you, as the responsible adult, and you don't have to wait until you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, or you don't have to wait until you're 92. You can do it now in your 50s, as someone in my family is doing, not me. But you can do it at any time in your life. You can make these plans, and the funeral home will keep them in a file for you until it's time to use them. But you can save all of that conflict and arguing and tension in your family if you make those decisions and express them and put them in a document. Is that fair?
Yeah, I can give you a lot of really bad examples.
I'll bet you can.
Go south quickly.
I'll bet you can. You can.
So you do want to avoid conflict and, kind of iron things out ahead of time.
Yeah. So focus on the word gift. Make it your gift, because that's what it truly is. At least that's how I feel. So thank you, Mom.
Definitely echo that comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Mom. Okay. It's time to say farewell for today. You know how it goes. Every Tuesday, we're back with another episode with another guest. Today's conversation has been great. I've got ideas spinning in my head, and I can't wait until David and I get together to talk about my own personal plans a little later this month. I've got some decisions to make. I still don't know what those decisions are, but I'll have more questions about what if. So with that in mind, everyone, take care of yourselves. Think about making that gift. If you did not experience that blessing with the person you lost, think about it and think about what you went through. Do you really want your family, your loved ones, to go through that after you're gone? I don't think so. So plan ahead and make sure to tune in next week as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.